All right, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Connor Torrialba. I'm on the support team here at Acctivate, and I'm going to be going through this webinar with you all to talk about the Webstore integration. So first off, let's start with just some definitions here about what the Webstore integration is. The Webstore module is a way of integrating Acctivate with your e-commerce platform to import in orders or customer info into Acctivate and export out inventory/shipping information to your web store of choice. So basically, it's a way of getting those orders in from your web store and then pushing out information like inventory levels and shipping tracking numbers to your web store so that you can keep track of that on both ends of the whole system. It's a nice way of eliminating some manual entry that might be going on if you're using e-commerce platforms but you don't have the web store module yet. This can be a good way of eliminating that manual entry. Just kind of an overview of some of the web store platforms that we have native support for within Acctivate. And so we have templates built out that have a really great starting point for each of these web stores. Some of them like Magento, there's Magento version 1 and Magento version 2. We support both of those. But all the major ones are pretty much supported here. If you have one that you're interested in looking into and you want to see if we might be looking to support that in the future, then go ahead and contact us about that. Go ahead and reach out and say, hey, we're looking to use this web store platform. Is this something that you guys are working on, or how can we use this? We actually have a native template that allows you to connect into custom web stores. So if you have a custom solution, we have a way of supporting that. But I'd suggest reaching out to your support team for more information about the native solution if you want to use that. I want to go over a bit of an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about the basics of setup. It's different for every template, but we're going to go over the basics. We're going to talk about xpaths, and these are some advanced settings that you can do within your web store platform template options so that way you can really control what comes into your web store and what comes out of your web store rather, and what goes into Acctivate. We're going to talk about mapping fields, so how the mapping works and what to do there. Daily usage, how to use the web store integration, how the web store orders come in and how they can be tied into alerts, and then how we can process those orders that come in from your web store through the order manager through things like scheduling, workflow status changes, picking, and invoicing. And then finally, we'll talk through how we can ship these orders and then push back that shipment information to your web store. So I'm going to go ahead and switch back to my desktop. And here we have Acctivate's demo version open. Now I've already done the liberty of setting up the basics for this web store. We're going to be using the Shopify integration for this demonstration today. Again, there's multiple ones you can use when you're working with Acctivate and web store integrations, and they're all a little bit different. So we're not going to be going into the intricacies of how we set up the Shopify template today. Again, I would recommend reaching out to your support team for help on that. We even have a guide on our help site called Initial Web Store Integration Setup that has the exact steps for each. So you can look over that article, or you can reach out to us to get some help there. But basically, you'll go into web stores, web store sync, and then if we're going to configure this a bit, which we're going to do, we'll go to configure. Then I'm going to expand out this window a little bit. Then we'll go edit. And so here we can give when we're setting this up initially, we can set up an ID and a name. We can change the name after the fact, but we'll leave this at Shopify test for now. Here you have where you'll set up your source URL and whether or not it uses an API key or a password or an encryption key or something else. That depends on the template. And so for Shopify, it requires a store URL and the API key and a password. I think the API key is a temporary thing, and then you get a permanent password. Anyway, you can talk about that more with us later. We'll go on to the next one. And here are the template options. Now this is where you'll probably spend the most time playing around with the general options with your web store. And we're going to go through the major ones here today. So what we'll do is let's start at the top where we have automatically retry importing skipped orders. Now, what this means is that you might have orders that get skipped in the web store sync, and you might be asking yourself, well, why would we have skipped orders? The reason for that is if a customer is on your web store and they're in the midst of setting up their order and they haven't paid yet, but they're still browsing around and you run a sync, that order still exists in Shopify, for example, but it isn't complete yet. It hasn't been submitted for real yet. So Acctivate will see that, and it'll mark it as pending, and then it'll skip it. And it'll say, okay, we're going to come back to this later. And what we can do here is we can set up this automatically retry importing skipped orders so that every time you run a sync, Acctivate will look over its list of orders that have been skipped and retry importing them. So that, hopefully those people that are still shopping around, they've made their decision, they've completed their order, and they're ready to get imported in, and then we can bring them in. The only reason why you wouldn't want this to be set to yes is if you have a lot of pending orders in your system, and that's a common thing, and you have hundreds of orders that stay in pending for a long period of time, that can cause your sync to run slowly over time, and so it might be a good idea to leave that off, in which case then you can go through the alerts to manually re-import those skipped orders, and I'll walk you through that later. The next one is going through the inventory export options. As you can see here, our template options are arranged alphabetically, so some of them are not quite together in their category. So export inventory and the warehouse IDs for inventory export, and even the export inventory by alternate ID. They're not all in the same place, but we're going to kind of talk about each of these options in sections of what's related rather than kind of repeating ourselves. But exporting inventory, the way that works is you can export your product inventory levels to your web store. And what that means is if I were to open up a product here in Acctivate, we'll just grab this one, and we were to export this product information to our web store, it would show in our web store that we have 670 on hand. Now, that's helpful because then on your web store side, it'll make sure that stuff stays up to date about what's in stock or what's out of stock. So it doesn't export like product information, like you can't create products on your web store from the Acctivate sync with the web store. It just exports inventory levels. A couple things to note about that is that you have to make sure that the product is marked as available on web. So for example, this product wouldn't export to the web store. It wouldn't export this quantity for the F warehouse unless we mark it as available on web. Now, if we are going to export the quantity for the F warehouse, we have to make sure that there's a recent transaction in the F warehouse. So if I were to run the sync for today, for example, dated 2/27/2019, and I had just recently marked this as available on web and tried to run an export in our web store sync, nothing would update for this product because the latest transaction is dated 4/6/2018. So I'd have to post a more recent transaction to update the timestamp. If you're curious about what that timestamp is or when the most recent transaction was, you can easily just go to the transactions field here, tab here, and then select the right warehouse for the product. Or you can even go into a view called product availability by template, is the view that you can go to and then see what the most recent timestamp is, and that's the timestamp that we use when we're exporting to the web store. Next, alongside of that, so we have the export inventory, the commerce separated warehouses for inventory export, and then we have the export inventory by alternate product ID. So what you can do there is, for the warehouses, this determines which warehouse's inventory we're going to export, and for the purposes here, I just have the F warehouse like we discussed. Export inventory by alternate product ID. This exports, if you're using alternate product IDs on your web store that don't match exactly what your normal Acctivate product ID is, then you would use this option. For us, we'll say no. And then there's, of course, the general export inventory option. Next, beyond that, we have the create customers. We have create customers for guests, and then we have import customers. And we can set these either as both yes, or one yes and one no, or all of them to no, and just use a bulk customer. But in general, we'll start with the create customers for guests. If somebody checks out of your web store and they are a guest, they haven't created an account on your web store, then we can create a customer for them in Acctivate using the information on the order, so the ship to and the email and stuff like that. We can grab that from the order document and create a new customer here in Acctivate for you based on that guest information. In a similar vein, if the customer does have an account on your web store and they make a change, or they make an order and they haven't already been created in Acctivate, then we can import in that customer information as, in a little bit more of a detailed fashion than it would be from just the create customers for guests. Now, I actually had a question about this the other day about importing in customers for guests, actually for just the regular import. And one thing I want to point out is that there are two IDs used for customer imports. The first one is, of course, the customer name. Like, for example, we'll pull up one of these here. So if the customer on my order in Acctivate has this exact same name, then Acctivate will know to match it to this customer. That order will be placed under this customer. But let's say we have another customer that's also called Birch or something very similar to that coming in off the web store. Acctivate actually uses this field called the web customer ID. And what this is it's a specific numerical value that is generated by every web store for each individual customer on that web store. And so Acctivate actually looks for this web customer ID first before it even looks up here. So whatever you have set up for your standard of how web store customers are created with their IDs, Acctivate's going to look here first. So if it finds a match in the web customer ID, it's going to match that order to this customer. If there is no match, if this doesn't match up here and it doesn't find a match up here, then it's going to create a new customer. So again, our first priority is the web customer ID. Beyond that, it's just the customer name, and then if no match is there, it'll create a new customer for you. If you are going live with a web store and you have a long list of customers in your web store already, it'd be a good idea to get an export from your web store with all of your web customer IDs in place. Sometimes it's just called customer ID or something like that. But getting an export with all of those customer names and their associated IDs, and then entering those in to your existing customers here in Acctivate will ensure that no duplicate customers are created once you start running your web store sync. Just a good idea to keep in mind. Next up, we have create reminders for warnings and business alerts. What this does is if there's a warning on an order, it'll create an alert in business alerts for it, so that way you can review it later. After that, we have the timestamp of the last order imported in. Talk about this real quick. This one is something you might actually change quite a bit here and there. What this does is it deals with, if my last order imported in was on 2/25/2019, then Acctivate is going to look for all orders placed after 2/25/2019 at this specific time. If there's an order that's newer than this timestamp, it'll bring that order in. Now, you can backdate this. Like, for example, if I think that I've missed some orders from last week, I could backdate this to an older time, and then it would grab any missing orders. It doesn't duplicate any orders when you backdate the timestamp here, but it can grab missing ones if there are any that are missing. The other thing I wanted to discuss is, of course, the export shipments. And there's a couple different fields here regarding that. There's export shipments, export carrier when exporting shipments, and then default quantity. For exporting shipments, we can export the carrier information. We can also export the shipping quantity, which is discussed here. And you can determine which type of quantity that is, whether or not you're shipping the invoiced quantity, the ordered quantity, or the scheduled quantity. For shipments in general, we export the tracking information. So if you've created a shipment in something like FedEx Ship Manager or UPS, then we can grab that tracking number and place it on the web store side once you've exported the shipment. A couple last things to note. There's the basic authentication instead of OAuth. That depends on, it's circumstantial depending on what web store template you're using and the time zone of the server. This is another one I've seen come up here and there. I wouldn't mess with it too much unless your web store team notes that there is some time zone difference that you need to be aware of, and then you can discuss that with our support team here to get further information. Then verbose logging, that gives us all of the information about what's coming out in your web store, so that if you are running a sync, it'll give us the XML data and stuff like that, so we can kind of look back on what's been imported in and all of the details of the data that came through. Usually it's good to keep this at yes, just so that you can go back and check stuff, but if you end up having thousands of orders come in per day or something like that, you might want to turn to no, otherwise you could fill up your hard drive with a bunch of logs. So up to you with what you want to do there. Then next, we're going to go on to our next set of discussions, dealing with xpaths, which are here in this screen here, and the mapping. I want to start first with the mapping, because I think this is where everything stems from in the xpaths. The xpaths are kind of like the engine under the hood. So here in the mapping, you've got different fields that you can open up, kind of file folders, so to speak. And let's open up the order one. And here at the order header information, you can enter in information about what's going to come in for the carrier, or what's going to come in for the order date. Now, we have the web store field up here in this column, and then we have the default value over in this column. Let's say that for all of my web store orders that come in from Shopify, I want them to go to the F branch. I don't ever want to map it based on anything. I want it to come in from the F branch. I would set that in the default value, because what that does is this makes sure that every web store order that comes in uses the F branch. If I wanted to set something like the company email to be the email that comes across on the order, I can grab that from one of these fields that's already mapped. So let's say we're going to use the customer email. We can map that here, and then we can pull the customer email from the order in the web store that's coming through and place it on the company email on the order that comes in on Acctivate. But the real question is, how do we determine what this customer email field here is actually pulling from? Where is it actually pulling from in the data? And that's where the xpaths come in. And so I'm going to open up an XML document, and that's from our Shopify web store, and I'm going to have this source values page up here. So this right here is kind of a basic XML document for orders, and I know it can look kind of intimidating at first. It was pretty intimidating for me at first looking through it, but as I got used to reading over it and stuff, it begins to make sense. The madness begins to make sense. As you look over this, you might notice that there's kind of a hierarchy to the way that the data is laid out. You've got your orders up here, then you've got order, and then you have data about the order. Over in the XPath section, it works in a similar way. For the most part, you would change your, if you're dealing with customer data, you'll go to subdocument customer. If you're going to order data, you'll go to subdocument order. For the most part, you'll just be dealing down here in the value section, not really in the tables or the namespaces. You can leave those as is. But here in the values section, this is where we determine what those mapping titles, how those actually work. So first off, we have the name, which is just the title for the XPath. So for example, we used customer email right here. We use customer email, and we can see that it's using this path, order, then it goes to customer, and then it goes to email. So if we trace that, we can go order, scroll down till we see something that says customer. And it might not actually be on this particular document. It should be, but let's see. There it is, customer, right here. Whoops. And then email. So this is the match, this is the path on where the data is located, and then the select is what we do with that data. A period just means that we grab the data, whatever it is, grab it and return it to us. So again, the name is simply the tag for the XPath. The match is where we're looking for the data for the XPath, and then the select is the coding for the XPath itself. And we're going to go through two basic xpaths today that I think that if you can understand these two at a basic level, you can have a lot of control over what comes in from your web store, and it can really help you out going forward, so that way you can make your own customized changes and stuff like that. So we're going to go through a basic select script and an if statement, are the two that we're going to go through today. So for the basic select script, I want to grab the web order ID. And this is helpful because if I wanted to ever re-import in this particular order, I'll need this ID right here. This 78721 such and such. So what I would do is I would go into my source values page here. I would go to subdocument order. I'd scroll all the way to the bottom here where it's blank, and then I would add in web order ID as the title for it. Then I would say, based on the path that we just looked at, I would say orders, or order actually, yeah. And then what was the name of it? Let's look. ID, easy enough. ID, and then I would say I just want to grab that data, period. Cool. Now I can use that in our mapping by going to order document, order, and I want to put it in the reference field. So let's look for the reference field. Here it is. And let's scroll down to web order ID. There it is. Cool. Now, once we import in this order, or any orders going forward, it's going to grab that ID from this position in the XML and place it in the reference field on our order. Let's do something a little more complicated. We'll go back down towards the bottom. And here I want to grab the vendor data, and I want to place that in the, let me see, where did I want to place that? I think I wanted to place that in like the instructions of the detail line. Yeah, the detail section. So if I want to do that, let's find that first in the XML. And I believe I scroll down here. Line items, here we go. Line item, and then vendor. This is what I wanted to grab. So what I'll do is I'm actually going to use something a little easier here. I'm going to look for an XPath that already kind of ends me up in the same location. So let's see. There should be one. Line items. Here we are. Line item. And then grams and ID. I think even name. So these are all in the same section as the vendor. Yeah, ID, right there. So what I can do is I can actually just copy this match here, scroll on down to the bottom, we'll say vendor, and we'll place this right there. And we'll take away ID because we're not grabbing the ID, we're grabbing the vendor. And we'll say period right there. Cool. So now what that should do is it will grab the vendor from the line item vendor section. Now let's map that on the detail section. We'll go to the line item reference and we'll say vendor. Cool. So this should pull in the vendor information and place it on the detail section of a line item. So for example, if this was an order we pulled in just now, it would place that vendor name right here in this field for reference. Alright, so those are two basic select scripts. One of them was a little more complicated, but we can use pre-existing XPaths to get to where we need to go a little bit faster. Now I want to take you through the if statement, and we even have a preview of it right here. The if statement is a little more complicated than just a basic select. I'm going to pull up my slides once again. I want to talk about the if statement structure. An if statement here it's a lot like any other if statement in any other programming language. It's basically saying that if statement 1 is true, then do statement 2. If statement 1 is false, then do statement 3. So we can structure out an if statement to tell Acctivate if the order is pending in its payment status, then display a message saying payment pending. Otherwise, it's not pending, so return false. And what that'll do is we can use that data in our XPath to skip this order, mark it as skipped, to come back to it later if the order is pending. And so this is a really helpful script that we use on most of our Webstore integrations. And again, you can swap out this data here for anything else really. So essentially, the structure is, here's the if statement here, then if the data in this field, and we're going to say payment status with the period, if the data here is equal to pending, then let's show payment pending and say true. Otherwise, we're going to return false. So let's go back and see that in action. So we're in the order section, and we're going to go to the payment status. I believe that's the name of it. Let's double check. Let's see. Financial status, that's what it is. All right, cool. So let's see if we can find a quick XPath for financial status. There it is, right there. We're going to modify this to be that XPath we wrote up on the PowerPoint. So we're going to say A:, 2 capital I's with an F, open parenthesis. And so this is just starting out the code. Period. So if the data in the financial status field equals single quote pending, then let's say payment pending. Otherwise, false. All right. Now let's assign that to our skip message field here. So we'll go to skip message, and we will say header financial status. That's where that code is located. We'll map it right there. So what that'll do is once we're importing in orders, it will check to see what the financial status is. If it's pending, then it won't import it in. It's going to skip it, and it's going to say payment pending. If it is paid, then it's going to be able to import it in, and it should all work. One last thing to talk about here as we're in the mapping section is mapping a default customer. So for instance, if we don't want to have individual customers come in on an order, then we can have them all go to a bulk web customer. And this can be helpful if you don't want to create individual customer records for every single person that orders off of your web store. You just want them to all come in under somebody called like Shopify. So what you can do is instead of using the header customer ID thing here, we can unmap that. And we can say, I believe I set up one called Shopify. This is by contact. Let's go customer. Or maybe web store? There it is, yeah. So what this will do is it'll assign every order on the web store to come in under this web store customer rather than an individual customer. And what we would probably do in this case then is we would even turn this option and this option to no so that we don't import customers at all. But we won't do that for this testing here. We will keep the create customers option on. It was the header Activate customer ID. Cool. All right, so we have our xpaths set up, our basic xpaths, and we've got our general mapping set up. I saw a question come in just now about a guide for the syntax. There is. If you go to our source values, you can just click xpaths expressions, and that should open up a web page that talks you through. If you want to read through this whole web page, it'll walk you through everything you can possibly do with xpaths. It's helpful. It could take you a little while to read through it and test it out, but it's there if you want to see the syntax and everything. But we won't go through all of that for today. So we have everything set up here. It's all good to go. We'll close out and we'll say yes to save. Now let's talk through how we would use the Webstore sync on a day-to-day basis. Close out some of these examples I have open. You would go to Webstores, Webstore sync. You have a couple options. You can just hit sync now, which will import in everything since the last sync time, that date that we had earlier. Or you can go and do specific more options like a time range or something like that. Keep in mind that if you go through this option, this will create duplicate orders because it's a re-import function up here. I see some users use this as their main way of importing in orders, and then they wonder why they have a bunch of duplicates, and it's because this will circumvent the idea that we're not going to bring in orders that already exist, because Acctivate thinks you're just trying to re-import something. So be careful using this, otherwise you could end up with some duplicates. So just be judicious in your options here. So we can run it now as a sync now. We can also do a seek frequency. So we can set it to sync every 15 minutes, every 30 minutes, every hour, or every 5 minutes. I wouldn't recommend 5 minutes just because it can usually slow down your system. But if you set it to 15 minutes or 30 minutes, you need to make sure that this window is still open, like in the corner or something, or I think it can still work when it's minimized, but just make sure this window is still open if you're running it at a periodic time frame. For now though, we'll set it to be syncing once, and let's sync in some orders. Cool. All right, so there's some good information here of what we can see. First off, it's trying to import in 3 customers. We've got Peter Parker, Clark Kent, and Bruce Wayne, just having a little bit of fun. And then we've got this order is getting skipped because the payment is pending. This order is going to come in because it's not pending. And then it's noting that there's an unknown tax code. And this is just a warning. If you see the little yellow triangle, that means it's just a warning. It's just something informational. This data is not going to come through on the order specifically. So what you need to do in a case like this is set up a tax code in QuickBooks called Texas State Tax or whatever it is there, so that Acctivate knows what to do with this tax code. Or you need to make a change or an XPath or something to translate this Texas State Tax into something else that is readable for Acctivate. Here it says total amount doesn't match what's computed by the Webstore. That's probably because the tax isn't coming through correctly. And then we find another order, which we're going to bring in because there was no payment pending, and the same 2 errors, or warnings rather. And so at the end it says there were 2 orders created. Let's complete the sync. And here it's exporting data to our web store. So it should be trying to export like shipment data and the inventory information, right? Those are the 2 things. Once this finishes up, we can check through to see, take another look at that skipped order to see what happened with it. Cool. The sync finished. We can even take a look at these orders directly by double-clicking. You can see that this order came in for some tuxedo stuff, LED high tops and a black bag for Peter Parker. Came in with the payment information and all that. There's our reference that we mapped, and there's even the vendor in the reference field. Cool. But what about that skipped order? Let's take a look. If we go to our alerts field, our alerts option here, we can see a couple things actually. Down here, it created an alert for us because there was a warning. We got these 2 warnings on this web store order here. And so what we can do is we can look over these later, or we can assign them to certain users in Acctivate. Say, hey, look over that web store warning we got on that order. And then they can look over it and determine what they're going to do with it, whether they're going to make an adjustment or make a change in Acctivate or on the web store. But for those skipped orders, we can go to Web Orders, and here is the order that skipped and the reason why it skipped, payment pending. We can try to re-import it. So if we were to check the box here and hit retry import, it'll still not work because the payment is still pending. But let's say that we go into our web store and we mark it as paid. So I'm just going to go ahead and mark this as fulfilled, or marked as paid. Cool. We'll minimize that. Now if we try to re-import it, it should come in. 1 order created, complete sync. Might take a second for it to export again. But since the payment is cleared, we don't get that skipped warning anymore. Now, if I were to run another sync in general, rather than going through the business alerts way, it would still re-import that order because we had marked it to export orders, to re-import skipped orders if there's any that are skipped. Cool. Then if we go back in here and refresh, we'll see that the order is gone. You'll want to check this periodically as you run your syncs because, again, it can fill up if there are any, tons of skipped orders over time. If there are a ton that fill up in here and they're never actually going to clear, never actually going to be fulfilled or paid and everything like that, you can just check all or check the ones that are never going to clear and then hit delete checked. That doesn't delete the order from your web store. What it does, it just deletes it off this list, this double checking list here. So it just makes sure that you don't end up taking a ton of time in your syncs or anything like that. So let's close these out. We'll talk about a few other things before we get to the rest of the Q&A. So we've brought in some orders, and how are we going to manage these orders once they're in? We've got some good options for that. A lot of it comes through the web from the order manager. If we go here to the order manager, go to open. Let's go order date. Let's see. There's some of them. Yeah, here they are. Cool. We can do things like schedule these orders. We can do some options like changing the workflow. So for example, if I wanted to take a couple of these orders that we imported in and schedule them, I could just click Action, Schedule, and then it'll schedule all the items on that order. Alternatively, I can even change the web store workflow status by going to something like Ready to Pick. Cool. As you can see here, now the workflow status has been updated. We can even, once we've set it to this, we can go to Actions and we can print pick tickets. Yeah, so we can print pick tickets or pick pack lists or whatever just directly from the order manager. So that way you don't have to go through all of your individual web store orders that come in. You can do some bulk actions here. And finally, we can even do things like prepare invoices. So we could create the invoices for these orders that have just come in. And then once we run a sync after we prepared the invoices, it would export that inventory information, the inventory availability for the products ordered, to your web store, so that you can see what your stock on hand is based on orders that have been entered in your Acctivate. So let's go ahead and quickly try to get one of these orders run through FedEx Ship Manager, just as a demo. And if you're familiar with the integration with FedEx, I think we've got another webinar on this information, or at least some guides on our help site. You can learn how to set all this up. But here we're going to import in this order to FedEx. I'm going to go ahead and set a few fields here. Cool. We have shipped it. And so now if we were to refresh, it's probably going to say UPS ground because that's the default for it. Oh well. If we were to refresh over here in your packages tab, you'll see that the order has come through now. Carrier is off there just because I didn't change it earlier, but it would come through with the appropriate carrier that you set here at the order level. So as we can see, we have a tracking number there, service, and a carrier. And if we were to run the Webstore sync following that process there where we've shipped it, that tracking number information will come through on the order. So we'll try to do that real quick, and then we'll jump to the Q&A. So I'll run a sync. Shouldn't be really any orders to bring in. Just notices that there's customers, but there's no orders created. So it's exporting the data now. Okay, completed. If we were to open up this order in Shopify, I believe it's the Peter Parker order. It's going to refresh. It's marked as fulfilled now, and we can see the tracking number come in, which is great. So the export worked. The tracking number from Acctivate translated over to the tracking number in Shopify. So that was kind of the bulk of what all we were going to discuss. It's the basics for the Webstore import. It's a powerful tool that can be highly customized. For specific cases or more advanced configuration, you'll likely need to work with one of our support reps. But you can play around with the settings of xpaths and stuff like that and get to know how the whole thing works. And if you do that, you'll unlock a lot of potential. So I'm going to try and cover some questions here. Let me see. What's our first one? Can you select to export available quantity instead of quantity on hand, so we don't sell reserved quantities? Let me see. I don't believe so. I think that it is just the quantity on hand is what we pull, because that's what's in the orders. What is it? The product availability by template. I believe that's what's pulled there. Oh wait, I'm noticing it's switch that around. Sorry, it's the quantity available. Sorry about that. So let's see what the next question is. So it's by default it ships out the quantity available, not the quantity on hand. The next question is, does Acctivate have an open API? How does the integration work for custom sites? I mentioned that there at the top. If you go to Webstore Sync, configure, let's say we're going to make a new one here, and we're going to make it for a custom one. We would go to create, and we would say custom. Next. Then there is an option on here called native. And this is for custom integrations. We have a whole article on the native Webstore template, which is what you can look up on our help site to see what goes into utilizing the API for the native template. Your webmaster should be able to understand how that works. And if they have any questions, they can reach out to us. I have a question about the auto sync. So if you wanted to do an automatic Webstore sync in the background of your store as the day is going on, you don't want to have to go in here and hit sync now every time. You can just go to Webstores, Webstore sync, set the frequency to whatever time frame. Again, I wouldn't recommend 5 minutes just because that can kind of bog down the system a bit, and it can lead to just a ton of log data over time. So we could say every 15 minutes or so, and hit sync now. So this will sync in the background. Once it's finished, it'll restart after 15 minutes. One thing to keep in mind though, as this is syncing, you'll want to make sure that someone's checking it throughout the day, because if this encounters an error, if there is an actual error in the sync, it's going to stop the sync and it's not going to continue on in 15 minutes. It's going to linger there. So you want to make sure that somebody has an eye on it throughout the day to check for those errors and stuff like that. Another question says, inventory balances are restricted to items that have a recent transaction. What is the time limit? The time limit is just the time limit is based on the most recent transaction for that product. So for this one, for example, that's a kit, bad example. Hang on. This one, are there any in the F warehouse? Cool. For this one, it shows what the last transaction was, and we can compare that timestamp right there for that transaction to the timestamp for our web store. So we can go into edit here, next. So any transaction after this timestamp is going to update the available quantity to the web store. So for example, this one wouldn't be updated because it's prior to this timestamp here. So there's no really a time limit. It's just whenever the last sync was run. So this is your timestamp here. I got a question here about the web store ID, the customer web ID. Is the ID number created by the e-commerce site? Yes, it is created by the e-commerce site. It's sent over to us from them, and then we enter that into the customer's field here. And that's entered in at the time of that customer's creation. If the customer already exists in Acctivate, you'll want to make sure that you grab that from your e-commerce site and plug it into this field here. Otherwise, you'll end up with duplicate customers or orders in the wrong direction. We got a question here about business activity creation. I'm not sure what you're referring to regarding web stores. Is that about alerts, perhaps? If you're talking about alerts, then in the options here, we can create warnings or business alerts. We can create business alerts for warnings. So the information that typically comes in, clarify that it is alerts. The information that typically comes in can be shown here. It's the warning that you get on your web store sync when you're importing in. So it's just another way of seeing what information came through at that one point when you ran the sync. So that way, that information is recorded to know, hey, what was the warning there? Why should we look over this again? It contains the information here, and then it also links to the specific sales order that warning is attached to. All right. Thank you guys so much for joining in. Again, you can always jump into our help site for more information on most of the things that we discussed here. We've got articles on, or you can contact us at the support team for specific help with whatever situation you're going through with your web store. Again, it's so customizable that every situation is a little bit different, and that's great, but it also means that sometimes you've got to reach out to us so that we can take a specific look, like that question asked earlier, at what your situation is so that we can help you out and get it working exactly as you want it to work. But thank you so much for joining us. If you have further questions from the webinar and everything, feel free to create a support ticket on our help site or call us, and we'd be happy to answer those questions. And once again, hope you guys have a fantastic rest of the week, and appreciate their time. Thanks.